On August 14th, 2005, a strange and unsettling presence hovered over the skies of Athens, the capital of Greece. Roughly 10,000 meters above the earth, a passenger jet was gliding in eerie silence, making no contact with anyone. The most frightening part was this. For nearly 2 hours, the aircraft had ignored every transmission from the control tower. Tension thickened over Athens. Was this a coordinated terrorist operation or a hijacking unfolding in real time? Acting on that fear, the Greek Air Force quickly launched its fighter jets to intercept the intruder. When the interceptors closed in, the pilots glimpsed a sight that defied belief. Inside the aircraft, everything looked frozen in time. There was no movement, no stir. Passengers remained slumped in their seats, utterly motionless, and, at first glance, no one appeared to be in the cockpit at all. A moment later, the F-16 pilots saw a figure in the cockpit, someone who did not look like a pilot. He moved anxiously around the controls, as though searching for a switch or trying to understand the panel. Suddenly, the airliner banked to one side and began a rapid descent toward the ground. Minutes later, the jet smashed into mountainous terrain north of Athens. All 121 passengers and crew members were lost. But what exactly had taken place? Why did the cabin look like a silent tomb? Why didn't the pilots or crew answer a single call? And what happened after takeoff that ultimately turned a routine flight into catastrophe? This is the grim account of Helios Flight 522, the tragedy the world remembers as the ghost plane. On the morning of August 14th, 2005, 115 passengers and 6 crew members boarded Helios Flight 522 at Larnaca Airport in Cyprus. Its final destination was Prague, in the Czech Republic, with a scheduled stopover in Athens. It was peak summer, and most of the travelers were holidaymakers from Cyprus who were due to disembark in Athens. Commanding the flight was a seasoned captain, 59 years of age, with more than 17,000 flight hours behind him. The first officer, 51 years old, had accumulated about 7,500 hours in the air. Ordinarily, investigations dwell on whether the crew's skills were sufficient. But this time, the narrative took a different turn. The 2 pilots had flown together before, and the first officer had frequently confided to friends and family that the captain's pressure and strict demeanor made flights stressful. The airline was already aware of tension between them. Training records revealed another concern. The first officer occasionally struggled with checklist discipline, a detail that would later become painfully significant. The aircraft was a 7-year-old Boeing 737-300. It departed Larnaca smoothly in the cool morning breeze. Climbing through 10,000 feet, the crew contacted Nicosia Air Traffic Control, requesting a cruise altitude of 34,000 feet, which was approved. But as the jet passed 12,000 feet, a warning alarm suddenly sounded in the cockpit. It was the same horn normally heard on the ground before takeoff if the aircraft's configuration isn't set properly. Hearing it mid-air shocked both pilots. 90 seconds later, the captain called the airline's operations center. He reported that the takeoff configuration warning had activated and said the ventilation cooling fan lights were indicating off. He asked the engineer where the circuit breakers for those systems were located. The engineer replied that those lights should indeed be off in flight, and that the relevant circuit breakers were behind the captain's seat. When he asked the captain to confirm the issue, the captain responded ambiguously, "It is not closed." The engineer didn't know what the captain meant by that. Then the engineer remembered something important. The night before, he had checked the airplane's pressurization system. The controls for that system sat close to the panel the captain seemed confused about. So he asked a crucial question. Is the pressurization mode set to auto or manual? Instead of answering, the captain repeated his earlier query. Where are those circuit breakers? Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, oxygen masks suddenly deployed from the ceiling. Shortly afterward, Helios ground operations lost radio contact. The airplane continued climbing to 34,000 feet, but every attempt to reach the crew failed. Helios operations then contacted Nicosia ATC and asked them to try to re-establish communication with Flight 522. For the next 5 minutes, the controller repeatedly called, but the jet gave no reply. ATC asked a nearby aircraft to attempt contact as well, yet that effort also led nowhere. By then, Flight 522 had crossed into Greek airspace without clearance, still following its programmed route. Nicosia also tried the emergency frequency, but silence persisted. They contacted Athens ATC to check if any transmissions had been received from the Helios flight. No one had heard a thing. At that point, 2 possibilities stood out. Either Flight 522 had a radio transmission failure and could hear but not transmit, or the crew had been incapacitated or forcibly subdued. Treating the first scenario as plausible, the Athens control tower cleared the aircraft for landing, hoping an approach clearance might trigger an automated response. But no sign of a landing attempt came from Flight 522. After more than 20 unanswered calls, Athens ATC notified the Greek Air Force that an aircraft had entered controlled airspace without permission and was not responding to any messages. 2 F-16s were immediately scrambled to intercept. Up to this point, Flight 522 had rigidly followed its autopilot path. It had already overflown its expected descent point twice. At 7:37 a.m., the aircraft entered a holding pattern over Athens International Airport, circling as if waiting for landing clearance. A holding pattern is a racetrack-shaped loop flown above an airport to delay arrival until approach is authorized. By the 6th circuit in the hold, the 2 F-16s had taken position alongside. It was now 8:30 a.m. One fighter pilot radioed back an astonishing report. He could see that the captain's seat in the cockpit was empty. He looked through the cabin windows on the far side, his view sharpened by the morning light. Passengers were sitting completely still, many with oxygen masks hanging from their faces. As the aircraft began its 10th loop in the holding pattern, one of the F-16 pilots noticed something new. A man in a light blue shirt and a dark vest stepped into the cockpit and settled into the captain's seat. He put on the headset and his hands hovered over the panel as though he was trying to engage the radios. The F-16 pilot signaled to him with hand gestures, and the man in the cockpit briefly waved back. Then hope evaporated. The left engine flamed out, starved of fuel. The jet rolled left and began to lose altitude. Shortly before 9 a.m., the aircraft again banked to the left. Soon after, the right engine also failed. About 4 minutes later, the airliner slammed into hilly terrain northwest of Athens and disintegrated. Investigators moved in immediately. They examined the wreckage and interviewed the engineer who had worked on the aircraft the previous night. He explained that he had conducted a pressurization leak test, which required switching the pressurization mode from auto to manual. After completing the test, he failed to return the switch to auto. At 34,000 feet, with the system left in manual, the cabin gradually depressurized. Under low-pressure conditions, the human brain has only minutes before cognitive function deteriorates, a condition known as hypoxia, or oxygen deprivation. Confusion sets in first, then poor judgment, then unconsciousness, and, if exposure continues, death. The pilots were obligated to verify the pressurization mode during their pre-flight checks. But because it is almost always left on auto, they did not catch the error. They had 2 more opportunities to notice the problem, before taxi and after takeoff, yet each chance slipped by. When the airplane climbed beyond 12,000 feet, the cabin altitude warning horn sounded. However, the crew misidentified it as the takeoff configuration horn, a mistake that diverted them to the wrong checklist. With their thinking already clouded by hypoxia, they focused on the supposed configuration issue and missed the real emergency playing out around them. Back in the cabin, the oxygen masks dropped and the nearby oxygen indication illuminated. But the early effects of hypoxia likely dulled the pilot's awareness and slowed their reactions. Soon, the captain and first officer lost consciousness. After approximately 10 minutes, the typical duration of the passenger oxygen supply. Most people in the cabin also blacked out. So, who was the person seen in the cockpit near the end? The investigation identified him as flight attendant Andreas Prodromou, who held a commercial pilot's license but was not type-rated on the Boeing 737. The cockpit voice recorder later revealed that after the engines failed, he tried to send a distress call. Tragically, he did not press the transmit switch, so no one heard him. Even if the radio call had gone out, flying and landing a 737 without engine power is extraordinarily difficult without specific training. And more heartbreakingly, by that stage, the passengers and most of the crew had been unconscious for far too long. Prolonged hypoxia causes irreversible brain damage, leaving survival unlikely. During the wreckage survey, investigators discovered that 3 of the 4 portable oxygen bottles showed signs of use. This indicated that Prodromou and perhaps 2 other cabin crew had used supplemental oxygen, which kept them conscious longer than the passengers and pilots. Even so, they faced an impossible situation. From this tragedy, the aviation industry absorbed hard lessons. Helios Flight 522 forced airlines, regulators, and manufacturers to re-examine procedures and training around pressurization and alarms. New standard operating procedures were introduced. Boeing and operators emphasized improved pilot training to ensure crews could clearly distinguish between similar-sounding warnings and immediately run the correct checklist. Cabin pressurization checks were highlighted and reinforced in pre-flight routines. Since the introduction of those changes, no accident of the same nature as Helios Flight 522 has occurred again. It remains a somber reminder that a single overlooked switch and a cascade of small misunderstandings can combine into a disaster of unimaginable scale.